I think most of you know, but if you've just joined us, we're going through the book of Acts, the fifth book of the New Testament. It's a great book. Could probably be called the adventures of the early Christians in many ways, as it narrates the first 30 years of what happened to the Christians after Jesus' death and resurrection. And it's pretty exciting stuff. I do one day think they could make a modern movie out of it, maybe a trilogy even. Maybe the same person who did Exodus, okay? You have a crush on Christian Bale, is that what it is? You've just nailed your colours to the mast there, Caroline. I don't know who would play Paul. The book of Acts was written by Luke, who wrote the third gospel. And he was a physician, a doctor of some sort. And, he sometimes includes information that gives medical background. And in fact, we might even see something of that tonight in the passage. We've been slowly going through, and we're up to this portion that was read to us tonight. We're up to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, you get the conversion of one of the greatest men in all of Christendom, a man by the name of Paul, although he was originally called Saul. And he gets converted from being a persecutor of Christians, one who oversaw the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. And then he gets converted on the road to Damascus in a very dramatic way. And it's all narrated for us in considerable detail in chapter 9. And then if you look down at the passage, or I've got it on the screen for you. Oh, here's Paul. Not quite Christian Bale. And we're going to look, by the way, in our passage at the Apostle Peter, who the focus comes on Peter. It's like Luke's camera moves from Paul to Peter. But the verse I want you to look at is this sort of transitional verse, and it's verse 31. Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened, living in the fear of the Lord, and encouraged by the Holy Spirit, it increased in numbers. Luke often gives us these little progress reports, usually at the end of a story, and he certainly does that here. The church throughout Judea, that's more to the south of Jerusalem, the capital. Galilee and Samaria, more towards the north. I think that's the first time in Acts Galilee is mentioned as now where the gospel post-Jesus is reached. People are becoming Christians. And the early church enjoyed a time of peace in these regions and was strengthened in their faith, strengthened in numbers. The fear of the Lord, living in the fear of the Lord and encouraged by the Holy Spirit, it increased in numbers. So this is a good moment once Paul was converted. He'd been persecuting the church, but as a result of him being converted, he goes from trying to persecute the church to now promoting the church and the Christian faith. It is quite a dramatic turnaround. And you get this progress report to say now there was a sort of time of peace amongst Christians and the churches. And that sort of neatly ends the story of Paul's conversion. We'll come back to Paul much for the rest of the book, actually. We find out about Paul. But Luke's camera, as I said, is now on Peter. And maybe it's because of this, of what happened here, that Peter was able to now go and speak in the towns that were in these regions. So it acts as an end to the Paul story, but a start to the next chapter in Peter's life. Now, I want to look at this carefully and as clearly as we can, and just sort of take you through the text. Some of you might have a handout. If you're not using a handout, you might want to give it to someone who does, who likes to take notes. But on the handout you'll see two sides. And the first side is just observations on the text, observations on the passage. And then after that, I'm going to look at a couple of questions on how we might apply it and what is this passage saying to us. So that's my aim this evening. So, first of all, some observations on the text. I'll just take you through it. You can have the Bible open in front of you. Some of you got it on your phone perhaps, or on the screen. But it's good to have the Bible open so you can see other things that mightn't appear on the screen in front of you. The first part of our passage. As Peter travelled about the country, he went to visit the Lord's people who lived in Lydda. This phrase, the Lord's people, translates a Greek word that is probably more literally translated holy ones, or sometimes a Bible might translate it as saints. And that is to say, all Christians are saints. There's not some super Christians who we call saints that are made into statues and things after they die. But all Christians are holy ones or saints, or as the NIV has translated the Greek word, the Lord's people. And if you call yourself a Christian here tonight, you are the Lord's. You can call him Father, you're in his family, you're a child of God. We are his people. Who lived in Lydda. And I guess most of us wouldn't know where that is. So let me give you a map, and here it is circled for us. It's about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. So Peter's come out of Jerusalem and he comes into this region, sort of lower Samaria, as you might be able to pick out on the screen there. And he goes to this town called Lydda. In the Old Testament, it has a different name, same town. It's called Lod. So you might want to look that up later on where it features in the Old Testament. But as I said, it's about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem, right near, by the way, the modern day international airport of Israel, the Ben Gurion airport, if you've been there. It's right near there, just south of there. And about 15 miles or so from Joppa. You can see that on the coast there, just above it on the coast. And that is sort of the bottom and going up to Apollonia. That's sort of all modern day Tel Aviv now, just so you have your geographical bearings. Now, Luke tells us the details of these cities, the names and things, because they're important. And I'll get to that a little later. It's not just narrative gloss just to say he went here and there, just so you can get your bearings geographically, but they're actually telling us things theologically, which I'll get to in a little while. Anyway, so Peter travelled about the country. He went to visit the Lord's people, the Christians, the early church who lived there in Lydda. And they were probably there because they'd been persecuted in Jerusalem and moved out there. Or as we saw in some chapters of Acts, Philip had preached roughly in these areas, and maybe they were recent converts from his evangelistic endeavours in those regions. There Peter found a man named Aeneas, who was paralysed and had been bedridden for 8 years. There's two ways of translating the Greek here, and that could be, one way of looking at it is that he was bedridden from the age of 8. But most people go for he was bedridden for 8 years, and I think that's the right translation. And it's not unlike Luke to tell us this. Luke tells us often little things that have medical implications. As a doctor, he doesn't just say the man was paralysed, but he notes the length of his infirmity. So maybe let's just, for imaginary sake, he's 38 years old. From 30 to 38, he'd been bedridden, paralysed. Pretty awful situation, as you can imagine. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up, roll up your mat. And immediately Aeneas got up. So Peter comes in and very powerfully and looks him in the eye and says, Jesus Christ heals you. He doesn't say, I heal you. He says, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. And Luke doesn't want us to miss this. This isn't Peter being a physician. He gives him some medicine, and then a few months or a year or so later, he finally sort of finds movement in his feet again and then slowly gets up. Immediately. He wants us to know that this was a miracle. Immediately, Aeneas got up. And as a result, verse 35, all those who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now I've got another place named there, and Sharon is sort of this area here. It's a big sort of coastal plain that stretches from Lydda and goes all the way up to virtually Mount Carmel near Caesarea, up towards there. So this affected so many people that many people in this region got converted as a result of this miracle. So that's the first miracle. There are just a few things to observe about the text if you're taking notes. Here's the second miracle. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha in Greek. Her name is Dorcas. So again, we've got another place name. And here's Joppa. So he moves from Lydda, 35 miles from Jerusalem, goes 15 miles west, hits the coastal town of Joppa. Joppa today is called Jaffa, but it is the same place where Jonah goes. Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh, so he goes down to a place called Joppa to get on a ship to sail to Tarshish to flee from God and preaching to the wicked Ninevites. So you might have heard the name Joppa before. But that's where, so it's got a long history. 1500 years or so by the time Peter got there in the 1st century AD. So in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. That's her Jewish name, her Aramaic Hebrew name. But in Greek she had another name, Dorcas. Now, if I had a daughter, I think I'd go for Tabitha over Dorcas personally. I'd stick with the Jewish name. I really wouldn't want my daughter to have the word dork in her name. So, Dorcas, I don't like it at all. Anyway, so she had two names, depending which circle. And, I don't know, you meet people like this. You certainly meet this in Australia, being so close to parts of Asia. And people have an Asian name when they come to Australia. And then when they get to Australia, they're called Brian, something like that. Anyway, she's got two names because of the culture. She was always doing good and helping the poor. Was a Christian? I hope so, but it seems that she was particularly noted for being a really kind person. And Luke wants us to note that. About that time, she became sick and she died. And as was the custom, you wash the body, and they placed her in an upstairs room of a house. Now there were several rooms in first century houses, depending on how wealthy and how big your house it was and all that sort of thing. But here is a couple of images of what we imagine first century houses to look like. As many of you know, I had the privilege in 2012 of doing an archaeological dig in a first century house, in a house that would have looked very much something like this. When it says the upper room, I think it mightn't have been that sort of first floor there. It may have been actually the roof that was covered over with maybe a sort of a bamboo or bark roof, wooden roof. I'm not sure it's really talking about that sort of first main living room. Given you got a dead person, they might have put it on a roof, which was possibly, or could also be called an upper room. Particularly if it was surrounded by, say, wooden walls and a makeshift roof. Lydda, as we've seen on the map, was near Joppa. So when the disciples, that is Christians there in Joppa, heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent two men to him. That's quite common in Luke. Not really sure why, but it's often two messengers or two men pop up all the time when a message is being taken to people. Maybe that was the custom of the day. They sent 2 men to him and urged Peter, please come at once. And then Peter, having compassion on the situation, Peter went with them. And when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to this room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Do you remember that Luke is writing to a Greek, a guy by the name of Theophilus? So he's gone now for the Greek name, Dorcas, not Tabitha. And by the way, it says here that they were crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. So it seems that she was some sort of tailor, maybe a fashion designer, one who made clothes and gave them to these widows, gave them to the poor. And Peter walks in, and there's no doubt there's loud volume, women crying, they're all upset, and he walks in, and as they're crying, they're showing him these beautiful pieces of clothing. And one commentator thinks that the word robe there shouldn't be robe or tunic, as in an outer garment, but inner ones, as in the undergarments. But I don't think that, because the women are showing Peter these things. So I don't think they're flashing Peter at this point. I think it's probably the robes, the outer clothing, and the shirts, blouses, frocks, or whatever they wore in those days. Okay, and they're very, very upset. And of course, death is terrible, but particularly when it's someone you love so much, who's been very kind to you, and that's the situation here. And Peter's there. Peter sent them out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Now, I think this is why it's the sort of the roof room, is because often the roof rooms you could still peek in and see what was going on. How else would we know, other than through the women, be able to peek in and look in and see what's happening? They wouldn't know that Peter got down on his knees and prayed. So Peter's there, he sends them out of the room, he gets down on his knees and he prays. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. And this is almost like a deliberate narration of the reversal of death. Because when someone dies, they're obviously laid low, and in many cases, particularly in the ancient world, you closed the eyes and then you prepared them for burial. But here it's kind of the opposite. She's laid low, and then she opens her eyes, and then seeing Peter, she sat up. And then once she sat up, Peter takes her by the hand. Not that there's any special power in Peter, but he reaches out just to give her a helping hand, and he helped her to her feet. And you can picture this in your mind as she rises from the bed. She's now standing there, perhaps a little wobbly at first. And then Peter called for the believers, especially the widows who loved her so much, calls them in and presented her to them alive. And they must have been absolutely stunned. And understandably, a miracle like this spreads fast. It's a great advertisement for the apostle and the Christian faith. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon, which is a curious way to end the story. Why does Luke give us this information? Have a think about that. Why does Luke bother to tell us where Peter stayed and the profession of the person he stayed with? I always find verses like that a little curious. Anyway, there's some things to think about and things to note in the text. I've just got 3 questions now for us to box around with. I've got questions because the Bible was given not for our information only, but for our transformation. The Bible was given not just for our information, but for our transformation. And I could run through the text and now we could sing our last song, but it's important that we now sort of think, what does this mean? How do we apply this? And so here are some things to think about. If you're a thinking adult, you'll go, well, we don't see people being risen from the dead these days. I mean, you might have read about it in some missionary journal in deepest, darkest Africa of some missionary in an unnamed village with an unnamed victim who was supposedly dead for a few days and then got up. And I don't deny miracles today. I think that God is a God of miracles and He can still work miracles today. And I believe in some cases I've seen them. But by and large, it's very rare. And I've certainly never seen or heard a credible story about someone rising from the dead. So you want to ask yourself as a thinking adult, do we really believe in these kind of miracles happening today? And why don't we see them in great quantity in church today? Why aren't we seeing people who are sick? In fact, people who aren't here tonight because they're sick. Why can't we just simply pray for them and they're made well like this? What's going on in the text? Well, we've covered this a little bit, but I think this passage really helps us in a really major way. And here I don't have the passage on the screen. You've got to have it open in front of you in the Bible at Acts chapter 9. Note in the first miracle that the paralytic has been in this condition, as Luke tells us, for 8 years. That means, now, Christianity has only been going for about 2 to 3 years at this stage. We're still in the 30s of the first century. But I think this man then has been in this condition for, let's say 12 months at least. And people would have been able to pray for him. And perhaps some of them prayed that he would be completely healed, but he wasn't. So he's in the Christian community and not being healed. At least for some portion of that 8 years. Christians couldn't heal him. But it's not until the Apostle Peter comes that he's healed. That throws the light back onto Peter. There's something special about Peter. He seems unique. The other thing to note in the text is that when Peter comes, he doesn't rebuke the people about the paralytic. He doesn't say to them, "Oh, ye of little faith, you should have prayed and he would have been healed." He doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't give them a lesson in faith and on how to heal. He realises that it's not something that is normal and that it's not something every Christian can do just like that. But Peter is an apostle. He's someone who's been appointed by Christ himself to be his representative, his ambassador, in a way that no other Christian, I think, has been chosen. As a full representative of Christ post-resurrection, Peter is endowed, as the other apostles are, with these miraculous powers. I think this was a special age in Christian history, in world history, where a number of people were given special abilities as the gospel progresses out of Jerusalem and makes its way through the Greco-Roman world. And again, I want to underline, I'm not saying that I don't believe in miracles happening today amongst Christians, or God can do miracles any way he likes. And I think he still does. But I think it was an acute form of salvation history where miracles were happening, particularly through his chosen apostles. So, second question on the text. How does this fit into Luke's purpose? Why has he included these two little stories about Peter healing people? There's a dramatic chapter, chapter 10, to come. And that is when the first fully non-Jewish person gets converted in chapter 10. It's a major story in the book of Acts. When I went off to Theological College, my first New Testament essay was on what happens in Acts chapter 10. It's such an important chapter. Why doesn't Luke just skip from Paul to Peter in Caesarea in chapter 10, where the first non-Jew is converted to Christianity? Why does he bother to give us these two little miracles before we get there? Well, I think the clue for us is in the geography. And the geography, as I said, is teaching us something about theology. Jerusalem is the capital of Judaism. It's the capital of Israel's religious history. And that's where Peter starts off in, and he makes his way to Lydda, which is a little less Jewish. Heading, as you can see, if I can use this thing, here's the region of Samaria. he's going up towards Samaria, which were kind of the place where there were half-blood Jews. So he's slowly creeping away from true, full-blood Orthodox Judaism, coming into these towns. And here he heals a paralytic. Then he moves further towards the coast. It's even further away from Jerusalem, where, as we can see in the names that he gives us, Tabitha and Dorcas, that this woman has two names. Why? Because in Joppa, you've got distinctly Greeks, Gentiles, non-Jews living alongside Jews. And any Jew like Tabitha would need a second name as she walks around and does business in Joppa. So these are slowly progressing away from sort of the traditional view of where the people of God were, now into these sort of pagan or semi-pagan areas. And then we get, in chapter 10, I've got this right, Peter now going to Caesarea, and this is clearly the most pagan city, given it's got a pagan name for the city here, Caesarea, named after Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And of all people, the person that gets converted there is a Roman centurion, someone who represents Rome and paganism and anything other than Judaism. So these are stepping stones for Peter to preach and convert the first fully pagan person in all the world. Cornelius, a Roman centurion. And also on this point, do you notice the length of each miracle? In Lydda, he heals the paralytic. It's 4 verses. Then in Joppa, we've got the raising of Tabitha. It's 8 verses. And then you've got 48 verses in chapter 10 on Cornelius. Also notice, here he's healing, in Lydda, he heals a paralytic. That's pretty impressive. But in Joppa, he heals someone who was dead. That's even more impressive. And then finally in Caesarea, it's a conversion. Actually, a conversion of someone as far removed as a Roman centurion is, in Luke's mind, the great miracle. Why? Because the greatest thing God has done is send his one and only Son to die for the whole world. And here is the first person, the first representative of the whole world, the rest of the world, outside of these early circles of Judaism. People becoming Christians in these towns. That's what Luke is doing. That's how it fits his purpose. Till finally the gospel reaches Putney and we get converted here. So that's, I think, how it fits into Luke's purpose. And then also quickly under this, do you remember I said verse 43 is a little unusual? Have a look at verse 43 with me again. Peter stayed in Joppa, but where did he stay? He stayed some time with a tanner, that is, a leather worker, named Simon. So now as he moved away into a slightly more sort of non-Jewish area in Joppa, he's also staying with a leather worker. And that's significant, because leather workers would have had animals that they killed regularly, that had blood all over the place, death all over the place, and yet this very impressive apostle is staying with someone who was, in Jewish terms, considered unclean. Peter is slowly being moved away from his idea of what is clean and unclean till he finally gets a major dream and ends up in Caesarea preaching and converting unclean Gentiles, so to speak. This is again a way of just teaching us that the gospel, the message about Jesus, is for all people, not just one particular race, one particular moment in time. Last of all, what are these 2 miracles pointing us to? These 2 miracles are pointing us to a couple of things. Number 1, they're pointing us to Jesus, to Christ. Do you notice it in the text? Verse 34. Aeneas, Peter said, to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. It's Jesus Christ who heals you. Not me. I'm not coming in and say, I heal you. It doesn't even say I heal you and now follow Jesus. No, the one who's healing you is Jesus. Jesus Christ has healed you. I'm just a servant of his. And look at verse 40. He doesn't say it here because Tabitha is dead. But what he does do in verse 40, he sends the widows out of the room and he gets down on his knees and prays. He needs God's help. It's God, all of Christ, who's going to do this. And he doesn't even touch the child to raise the child. That's only something Jesus could do. He prays, then the child sat up, and then he handles her. He helps her to get up. So there's nothing powerful in Peter's hands like it was with Christ. It's all about Christ. It's pointing us to Jesus. And also notice, and it took me several reads of the text to see this, but notice there's a theme of getting up. I don't know whether you spotted that. You're better than me, and you spotted that early. But look at it in verse 34. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. Immediately Aeneas got up. And then look at verse 40, the second miracle. Peter sent all the widows out of the room, and he got down on his knees and prayed, and turning to the dead woman he said, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. There's this idea of getting up. And that's because these miracles are a beautiful, gorgeous illustration of our own malady. We're all paralysed. We're all crippled. We're all in fact dead. All of us are dead before God. We try to walk, we try to get around. You mightn't feel dead, but you know when you get a rose and you cut it off a rose bush, it smells alive, it feels alive, it looks alive, probably even tastes alive, but it's dead. It's been cut off from the life source, and we're all like that. We can't walk. We're trying to walk on our own, but we can't. The world is paralysed without being plugged in, grafted in to the Maker, and that is really because we're all dead. But what Christ does is he comes and heals and raises us and gives us a new life so that we can live as was intended. And this is a beautiful illustration of not only pointing us to Christ, but it illustrates so wonderfully what Christ does for us. And then last of all, I think this miracle is pointing us to our response. And that is, we respond by repentance and belief. Look at verse 35. All those who lived in Lydda and Sharon, this region, saw him, and what do? They turned to the Lord. That's in one way of expressing repentance. Turning back to God. They saw this. They couldn't deny it. And they turned, they repented. They turned to the Lord, turned back to him. And look at verse 42, the conclusion of the second miracle. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. So repentance and belief. He's paralleled the two responses so that we don't miss it. That's the response, is to turn back to him and say, I'm sorry. I realise I'm crippled. I realise I'm dead without you. And, of course, he extends the hand and says, I will heal you. Get up. And we live a life out of gratitude and loyalty to him from that day forward.